Hi guys. So I'm not here today, but I wanted to make sure we keep going. So I'm leaving you work and this beautiful video so that you can do this without me. So you need this. There's a stack of it right over here on the desk. If you don't have it, come get it. Okay? You need it. This is what we're doing today. You are going to take notes on the next unit. You are not going to fill out the whole thing. What you are going to do, and I apologize, the pages still are not numbered, and there's a plane flying overhead, so you know how it is in this room. Just bear in mind, the windows are open. You are going through this packet. You are going to go up to this section, and you are going to stop here. So right here, reciprocal trade agreements, that's going to be your last note section. Do not do the rise of fascism and militarism yet. We will do that later. It's about 6¼ pages, front and back. You are going to use this book, this video, your friends, whatever you need to do to get through this. In this book, you are starting on page 541. But I'm also going to use this video to go over these points so that you have some more explanation than the book. That way we don't have to worry about missing a day of class for this, and next week we can just jump right into how things are going in World War II, Hitler, Stalin, all those good guys that are coming up. So we have to throw it back actually to 1920 and the end of World War I in order to effectively understand interwar foreign policy, which is actually really important to understanding what happens in World War II, because we really need to understand what the US is doing. So we know in the 1920s and 1930s, things are good and then terrible, right? We have the Harlem Renaissance, the Jazz Age, the Great Migration, but we also have the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, lynching, violence, all that stuff. So there's good and bad. A lot of people, general info here, a lot of people are disillusioned from World War I, which means they're very against war and the idea of what America is, what the world is. And they don't want to be part of a second war or any other war, realistically. So we are going to really grasp onto this idea that we should be isolated. We are not going to be part of the war over there or any problems in Europe. Those aren't our problems to deal with. We've already dealt with them once. It's not our problem. However, as we find out later, this doesn't really work. But they do make an attempt to avoid future wars through the Washington Conference, which is really a conference about disarmament. And all that means is eliminating weapons, lowering the amount of military supplies that each country has and how they're going to use them. So representatives come to the Washington Conference from other countries. We've got Belgium, China, France, Great Britain, the big countries at the time, Italy, Japan, Portugal, the Netherlands, all these places that are looking to work together to not go to war. And Japan and China are outliers, and they're a whole separate category that we have to talk about. But for the purposes of this, they are at the Washington Conference, and they're all going to agree to these ideals of what needs to be done to disarm nations. And so in 1921, the conference comes up with this whole group of agreements. No new warships for 10 years. No country can build a new warship for at least 10 years. There's going to limit the number of warships each nation has or is allowed to have. They are all going to agree to protect independence of China and respect the open door policy of trade from way back in the 1880s, 1890s. And what the open door policy is that everybody has the right to trade with China. It's a lot more complicated than that, but we don't have time to get into deep understanding. It comes up with something called the Five-Power Treaty, which means that the countries with the largest navies control how much other countries are allowed to build. I know it sounds crazy, but essentially this no new warships and this ratio number, those numbers are based on the 5 largest navies at the time, which are the United States, Great Britain, France, Japan, and Italy. Okay? So, for more specifics there, if you look in the book, the US has 5 warships. Great Britain has 5, Japan has 3, France is 1.67, Italy is 1.67. And then Britain and the US also agreed to limit what they're doing in the Pacific because they don't want to deal with Japan. And again, we'll get more into Japan later. The Four Power Treaty, which also comes from the Naval Conference. That is, the United States, France, Great Britain, and Japan agree to respect each other's properties in the Pacific. That will become a problem later on because there is questions about the Philippines and the Manila Islands and who they belong to. And then we also have the Nine Power Treaty, and that is all 9 nations that show up to this conference. And again, they agree to respect the open door policy. So if you break it down, really, the 3 agreements, there's the 5 power agreement, the 4 power agreement, the 9 power agreement. The 5 power is the limiting of navies. The 4 power is respecting territories in the Pacific. And the 9 power is respecting the open door policy, which we will find out Japan does not do. Again, that is the Washington Conference. The groups of, I don't actually know why this is above this instead of below it, but it shouldn't be. But so the groups, those 9 nations come together in Washington to make this deal of disarmament. Okay? If you don't know how to spell disarmament, that's fine. Just say like eliminating weapons. And then good things that come from this conference are it takes steps towards peace, but a negative is that it really does allow Japan to dominate in the Pacific and in Asia more than they already had. So if you turn the page, you've got the Kellogg-Briand Pact. This is not the same Kellogg from Kellogg's cereal. Don't be confused there. But this is what it sounds like. It is a pact between nations to end war. The goal of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, realistically, is just there'll be no more war. 60 nations actually agree to this. We're going to agree to not use war as an instrument of national policy. So war will only be used for defensive policies. You're not going to go to war unless somehow you are invaded. But if everybody's agreeing not to go to war, nobody will be invaded. Unfortunately, there is no way to enforce this. It's just essentially a gentleman's agreement. People are shaking hands and saying, yeah, we're going to do that. Again, Briand is French Foreign Minister, Astrid Briand. Kellogg, not the Kellogg's company. It is a Secretary of State at the time. His name is Frank Kellogg. And him and Astrid Briand meet, and I think they meet in France, and they agree to this pact. So it permits defensive wars. It's not eliminating all war, but the idea is that like there won't be a defensive war because nobody's going to war. And it also, again, there's no way to enforce it. So it's a nice idea, but it doesn't provide any help. If there were to be a defensive war, nothing happens. So who's stopping you from invading? That will be important in a few more years. So if we look on further down, again, why this matters here, business and diplomacy, I know it doesn't seem like it fits in here, but it actually matters to what is going on. We know, right, that business is not great during the Depression. So we have our 3 Republican presidents here. You may remember them from Unit 1. Harding, Coolidge, and everybody's favorite, Herbert Hoover. These 3, as if you remember from Unit 1, they're laissez-faire, they're pro-business, anti-government involvement, but they really work on strengthening U.S. relations with other countries. And what that really means by strengthening U.S. relations is that we are using our power as the U.S. to go to other places like Latin America and make business deals. Sorry, the announcements went off. So, back in 1917, we have this guy, Woodrow Wilson, who's not actually living his best life. He's actually living his worst life. Mr. Wilson here has attempted to create the League of Nations and sadly doesn't really go well. And he ends up dying of a stroke in 1921. But that's not really relevant to this. What is relevant is that he is president when we go to Latin America to make our business deals. And why that is relevant is because the Mexican Constitution, which has been in effect and has been worked on a lot at the time, in 1917, says that the Mexican government owns all of their national mineral and oil resources, which makes sense. Obviously, if it's your country, you want to own your resources. But the United States is very not happy with this. And Mexico is worried that the US, under this guy, will decide to come in and confiscate their property. And this actually is part of World War I because Germany had written a letter to Mexico and said, hey, if you guys invade the US, we'll help you out. So Mexico's a little concerned. And so they start to negotiate a peaceful resolution with the US, which actually does not get fully negotiated until Coolidge takes over. But with Mexico, we do negotiate a resolution that protects Mexicans' interests for their own mineral and oil in exchange for some business deals for us. Coolidge does not negotiate deals with everybody else. So in other places in Latin America, Coolidge is sending United States troops, even though we're not at war, even though there's nothing going on by 1920 in terms of war. Coolidge, who was actually president in 1923, is sending troops to places in Latin America like Nicaragua and Haiti. However, he does withdraw them from the Dominican Republic. So, depending on who you are, you're looking at us as either really helpful or really detrimental. The goal of this is to continue with the US having specific interests protected in these countries. And this also goes back to bananas and banana republics and capitalism and all that stuff that simply is really, we'd need to do an entire world history class on that to make sense of it. But just know that a lot of US businesses are in Latin America, especially the Del Monte Fruit Company, who is running banana plantations and sugar plantations across Latin America, across the Caribbean. We really need to protect those interests. And with our removal of troops in some places, but the introduction of troops in other places, our economic impact increases US investments to double from 1919 to 1929. So for Latin America, the business there, we are doubling our economic interests. And then if you flip it over, the Middle East, you guys probably don't have much of a background history on the Middle East. It's important to know that the Middle East is only the Middle East because we are a Western country. It's east of us, but if we were in Asia, it wouldn't be east of us, it'd be west of us. The Middle East is an encompassing region. It's the Arab nations. And in the 1920s, some of them are trying to decolonize from Britain. And the end of World War I was a great time to do that because Britain is trying to focus on rebuilding. So we've got some decolonization efforts, which again, we'll get into later. But there's oil in the Middle East. And the US has realized that oil is going to be very beneficial. The British control it because a lot of the Middle Eastern Arab nations are British colonies, but the US wants access to that oil. And so the Secretary of State in the 1920s-ish, I don't know exactly what date, the Secretary of State makes a deal with the British oil company that they will get drilling rights for the US in the Middle East. And this, again, will matter when we get further past World War II and into the Cold War and even into the 1990s, why even today we are so involved in what happens in Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan. It's all to do with oil and the rights that we got or took. Now, we've talked about tariffs. You guys know that tariffs are taxes on imports and exports, and as I'm sure is no surprise to you, there are tariffs. We talked about the tariffs during the Depression. We didn't really talk about the tariffs before that. In 1922, right as Harding is leaving office, they pass another tariff, the Fordney-McCumber tariff, which increases duties on foreign manufactured good by 25%. And anytime you increase by 25 or 30 or any high percentage, it's a lot. So we are going to increase tariffs on foreign manufactured good by 25%. And this is supposed to protect U.S. businesses, but as we know, in the long run, it does not. It actually ends up being more destructive and leads us to the Depression because the Europeans are not paying their war debts. And now we're taxing them as well. And we know from the last unit that when we tax the European countries, the European tax us, and nobody ends up being able to pay their bills. So, speaking of war debts and reparations, if you don't know what that stuff is, debt is what you owe another country, and reparations are what you pay to make up for something. Usually it's making up for a war. People ask for reparations for slavery today. It's essentially your country is paying to make up for something that they have done that has taken a lot of money or taken money from somebody else. So we know that before World War I, U.S. has money. And they actually have a lot of debt because they're importing more than they're exporting. But after World War I, we come out as a creditor nation where we have given a lot of our money and our supplies to other countries. So now we have more power because we are saying to these places, you owe us money. You have to pay us back. So by the end of World War I, we have given more than $10 billion to the Allied countries. And again, our old government friends here, people we didn't spend a lot of time on Unit 1, but now we're here, Harding and Coolidge are insisting that Britain and France pay back every single cent that we have lent them. And that's crazy. $10 billion is a lot. But their goal is that we want our money back. But Britain and France don't have the money. They argue that they can't pay us back because they've suffered such heavy losses. There's no way they're going to be able to pay the debt back. And on top of that, within the Treaty of Versailles, which a group of people had negotiated at the end of World War I, Germany is supposed to pay $30 billion in reparations to the Allied nations. So we sent out $10 billion. Germany has to pay $30 billion in reparations. That is an insane amount of money. Essentially, Germany was charged every single nation's war debt and told that they had to pay it all back to each independent nation so that those nations could pay us. And as you know from our last unit, there is no money. So Germany can't pay Britain and France because Germany doesn't have any money. And if Germany can't pay Britain and France can't pay the US. So another part of this, sorry, the announcements just keep going off, which we also talked about, is the Dawes Plan. And again, we touched on this already, so you should already kind of know what this is. We're just going to briefly rerun through it. The Dawes Plan was this idea under Calvin Coolidge, among other people, that we are going to establish a way of money flowing through from the US to Germany so Germany can pay it to the Allies so the Allies can pay it back to the US. And the way that we do this is we sell off land that was owned and was occupied by other people. And again, we already know that this leads to the stock market crash and all of that stuff. And the Dawes Plan collapses under that because There's no money. And the whole concept of the plan was kind of wild anyways. We'll give you the money so you can give them the money so they can give us back the money. It's not really making money, it's just moving money around. So the legacy of World War I and the war debts and the reparations, at the end of it all, one country pays back its war debt. Finland. So fun little fact there for trivia, if anybody ever needs to know that. Finland is the only country that ever pays its entire World War I debt. The unpaid debts of everybody else stick around, but it leaves a lot of bad feelings, especially Germany. Again, a lot of this stuff is going to lead us to what happens in Germany. They're charged $30 billion. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of bad feelings. And it also leads to the US saying, we want to be isolated. We don't want to deal with that. Leave us alone. Now we're back to our old friend Herbert Hoover, who, again, has a legacy of the Depression. He did do other things. There are other things going on during the Depression, but, we had to focus on what's going on at home. There are other things that he's focusing on. Every president has a foreign policy. They have to. It's part of their job. His foreign policy involves Latin America, of course, but he also has to worry about what's going on in Japan. So Hoover, again, he is kind of the idea that the U.S., he is the idea that Americans should be Americans and pull themselves up, but also that the U.S. should not be involved in other issues. If we can pull ourselves up, you can pull yourselves up. Let's stay out of it. So he does actually try to pursue more friendly regulations with Latin America. Even before he's actually inaugurated, he starts to make deals to pull the troops back out of Nicaragua. And he goes on what they call the goodwill tour of Latin America, where he is going to go end all of the policies of Taft and Wilson, all of them. So he does arrange for the U.S. troops to leave Nicaragua by 1933 and negotiates a treaty with Haiti to remove all the troops by 1934. So you can imagine that Harding, and Wilson, who worked so hard on this stuff, probably aren't feeling great about that. Although Wilson's dead, he doesn't know, so I guess that's fine. But Hoover's bigger problem, even though it doesn't seem like it at the time, or maybe it doesn't seem like it at all, is Japan. And a lot of people don't talk about Japan in World War II. They kind of leave them off to the side, and that's a big mistake because Japan is extremely aggressive. By the 1930s, Japan has taken over most of Asia. They honestly, under Hoover and everything else going on, Japan is probably the biggest threat to world peace. It's not Germany, it's not Stalin, it's not Mussolini, it is Japan. Because they have openly defied the open door policy with China. They have openly defied any of the things that the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles have agreed to. And in 1930, they march into Manchuria, which is part of China, and they take it over. So on September 31st, 1931, the Japanese troops take over the northeast region of China, which is known as Manchuria. They rename the area Manchukuo. They establish their own government there. And you will find this again with Germany in a few days, that they install what's called a puppet government. So it's Chinese, but they work for the Japanese. They're being told what to do by the Japanese. There's no actual ability of the Chinese to make their own decisions. And China and Japan have actually been in conflict with each other for decades, but this is one of the biggest egregious takeovers because it is blatantly aggressive. And we all just agreed back in the Washington conference not to do this. And so the League of Nations now has to make a choice. Do we do anything about Japan taking over China or not? Because we said we're not going to do that, but it's okay to go to defensive war. And so the League of Nations doesn't do anything. They say, you know what, you shouldn't do that. That's bad. And so when they do that, Japan says, all right, well, we're leaving the League. You guys we're just leaving. And nothing happens. So what this really does is shows everybody else that the League of Nations has no power. And that will matter for Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini. But Japan really shows these men that the League of Nations has no power. You can do what you want. Nobody's actually going to stop you. They're just going to say that they will. And that will lead us to a lot of future problems. So in the meantime, the US has to respond, right? So we have this guy here, Henry Stimson. He is Secretary of State, okay? And the US wants to respond to the Japanese violation of the open door policy because the US has its own issues with Japan, and we do have a naval base in Pearl Harbor, and we do have people in the Philippines and in Guam and all those areas that are very close to Japan. So we need to be careful because we don't want to make the Japanese mad. We need to protect our interests. And so they do, under Stimson, create a new policy towards Japan, but it's not very effective in preventing the Japanese from being aggressive. And so Secretary of State Stimson declares in 1932 that the U.S. is going to honor its obligations under the Nine-Power Treaty, we're back from the Washington Treaty, by, are you ready for this? It's very clever. They're not going to recognize Manchukuo as a different regime. They're going to recognize it that it's part of Manchuria still, it's part of China. And the League of Nations says, hey, great, we'll recognize that too. It's a great policy, right? We just won't recognize this as belonging to Japan. But that doesn't stop the Japanese. They don't care because you don't need to be recognized if nobody's actively stopping you. So Japanese people, the Japanese aggressors, they don't care. And that will lead to, future problems, which again, we'll get to. And now we have our final little section here of Roosevelt's policies and Depression diplomacy. Okay, so we're almost done. I know it's a long video, but if you want to read the book instead, feel free. Deeper understanding using both, whatever you want. So you should know all about this guy by now, right? We know what's going on in the US. Roosevelt has passed the New Deal. He is focusing on the economic crisis at home. He's not really thinking about foreign policy. What's going on here in the US matters. But he does extend Hoover's good neighbor policy to Latin America. So that's nice, I guess. So the good neighbor policy there, again, to Latin America is just that we're going to be a good neighbor. We're going to be a good neighbor to other people in the Western Hemisphere. We are not going to interfere as much. We are going to maybe pull back on some of our business interests. So that's general info for good neighbor policy if you want. Then he decides to go a little bit further. And so in 1933, we have the Pan American Conference. It's actually the 7th Pan American Conference. There's been 6 more previous to this. It is held in Uruguay in 1933, and Roosevelt promises, as the United States, to never again intervene in the internal affairs of any Latin American country. It's a good idea. Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin's older cousin, who was president in the beginning of the 1900s, he had the same concept. I lied. He didn't have the same concept. He had the exact opposite concept, where we were going to intervene in Latin America as an extension of the Monroe Doctrine. Franklin Roosevelt wipes that out. He says, we're not going to intervene at all. You guys are your own place. You do your thing. We'll do our thing. Everybody stay out of this. Then in 1936, and again, this will be important later on, we have another Pan American Conference in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And Roosevelt goes to the conference. And we know there's things going on in Europe now, although it's still kind of whispery. And Roosevelt pledges in this conference, the second one that he goes to in 1936, that he will put all future wars disputes up to arbitration, which means if anybody tries to invade anywhere in Latin America, other people will step in and judge whether or not this is war worthy or not. And he also warns that if a European power like Germany, he is very specific, like Germany attempts to commit an act of aggression against us, they're going to regret it, basically. Which is important to note because, again, at the end of the war, a lot of Germans go to Argentina. We'll revisit that, but for now, that's all you need to know. We also know Roosevelt has to deal with Cuba. Cuba has resented the U.S. since the Spanish-American War in 1899 because we told Cubans they could have their freedom, and then we said, no, you can't. We are actually going to make you a protectorate of the United States, which essentially means we get to tell you what you can and can't do, which makes no sense. If you're in your own independent country, you can't be told what to do by another country. So Cubans are very upset about this. And in 1934, this guy here convinces the U.S. Congress to get rid of that amendment. It's called the Platt Amendment. You should have learned about it last year. He convinces Congress to wipe out that amendment. He says, we're not going to intervene in Cuba at all anymore. The only thing we do keep is a Navy base in Guantanamo Bay, and that will matter very much during the Cold War. We also have Mexico. We talked about Mexico at the end of World War I, but now it's 1938, and Mexico is still not friendly with the U.S., with the government, with any of us, and they are really trying to check this good neighbor policy. So in 1938, the Mexican president Lázaro Cárdenas takes all the oil properties that were owned by U.S. corporations, says these are ours, and now the U.S. has to make a choice, and Roosevelt decides not to intervene. He says, I'm not going to send military intervention. I'm not going to send the National Guard or anything like that. He tells the companies it is up to them to negotiate a settlement. So it really does test the good neighbor policy, but Franklin lives up to that by not sending troops down to Mexico. Can we say that things were okay after that? I don't know, but it does lead to a future with Mexico where we have a more mutual understanding of each other. And finally, in this half-hour plus video we are wrapping up now, we have depression diplomacy, okay? This last little section here. And again, a lot of this stuff is more important to what's coming up, but you need to understand it in order to understand the war and everywhere we've been and where we're going. So we know that during the Depression, Roosevelt's goal was to help the American people. But he does, again, he has to work on other stuff. So one of the things that happens during this time is that Russia goes from being Russia in 1917 to the Soviet Union. And again, that's such a deep topic. We don't have time to go over that, unfortunately, but they become a bigger nation and they need to be recognized as a country. And our favorite three guys from before, these three beautiful, bald or almost bald white men, have refused to recognize that the Soviet Union is a real country because it's communist. And that goes against our capitalist ambitions, so we don't want to recognize them. Roosevelt comes along, and one of the first things he does outside of the American policies is to recognize the Soviet Union as a country. And he says he's doing this so that we can deal with them for trade. And this will actually matter, again, a lot during World War II, where we become allies for a moment to defeat Germany after Germany turns its back on Stalin after agreeing to a plan. We'll get there. We'll get there. The Philippines, again, also important. We talked about Japan. The Philippines, kind of like Cuba, we had taken them on during the Spanish-American War. We said that we would free them from their Spanish colonizers, and now we're taking them over. And we are governing the Philippines. We didn't even offer them their freedom. We decided that we needed to go govern them because they couldn't govern themselves. And so we have been governing them since 1899, but it's costing us a lot of money. Roosevelt convinces Congress to pass what is called the Tidings-McDuffie Act, which essentially sets the path for Filipino independence. So in 1934, Roosevelt passes the Tidings-McDuffie Act with Congress that says by 1946, the Philippines will be independent nation and the U.S. military will be removed from the islands. And that's going to be a problem during the war as well, but it does remain true, and the Philippines do get their independence in 1946. And then finally, we have reciprocal trade agreements, okay? I can't say the word right now. Reciprocal just means like you do it, I do it, we both benefit from it. We're both doing each other a favor. Okay. So again, we know that Roosevelt is a Democrat, right? He favors lower tariffs. He's trying to build the economy back. So all those tariffs from the Depression, from Hoover, all those people, he is going to lower those. And this is supposed to increase international trade. And so by the time Roosevelt is president in 1934, they enact a plan suggested by Secretary of State Cordell Hull that is going to give the president the power to reduce the tariffs. So Roosevelt reduces international tariffs up to 50% for any nation that will reciprocate with a reduction to US tariffs. So if we make a deal with France to say, hey, we'll bring down our tariffs by 50% if you bring down your tariffs for us by 50%, everybody's getting something out of that. And that is the reciprocity. I still can't say the word, but that is the reciprocal trade agreement. And that is also going to help increase the economy after the Depression. So this is not necessarily the boring stuff, but it is all the stuff that you should know outside of the war. And I know you guys are super excited to get into this rise of fascism and militarism. So make sure this stuff is filled out. Again, if you don't do it on this packet and you're doing it in your notebook, make sure every headline is labeled. I really would just use this packet. Like it's the easiest way to get the points for the notes. On Monday, we are going to talk about the rise of fascism and militarism. We will get deeper into the actual issues in Europe, Hitler, Stalin, all of them. And then we will go from there. So, any questions? Rewatch the video, read the book. I don't know what to tell you. Also, you can just email me, but I probably won't get to those until at least Monday. So, this is what you have. Again, feel free to use the book, your friends, whatever you need to do to fill this in. But I will see you guys later.